Welcome to Whispers of the Night. Tonight we journey to Istanbul in March 1932, where beneath the ancient Byzantine cisterns of the old city, a renowned English archaeologist lies dead with terror frozen upon his face. Stay with me until the very end, for this mystery reveals how the legendary ghost of Istanbul masks a crime of brilliant scientific deception. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories and the work I do here, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also join our membership for ad-free videos and exclusive mysteries. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Reading your comments always bring me joy. Now, settle in with a hot cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. The Ghost of Istanbul, Chapter 1. The Summons from the Golden Horn. The curious circumstances that would eventually draw me into one of my friend Hercule Poirot's most perplexing investigations began, as so many momentous affairs do, with the arrival of an urgent letter at my London club. The message reached me on a grey Tuesday afternoon in March, cutting through the comfortable hum of conversation and the gentle rustle of newspapers that typically marked that drowsy hour when gentlemen of leisure contemplated the approaching evening's diversions. The letter bore the unmistakable precision of language that characterized all communications from the little Belgian detective. Yet beneath its formal courtesy lay an urgency that spoke of matters requiring immediate attention. My dear Hastings, I find myself in the most extraordinary circumstances here in Istanbul, and I require your presence immediately. A most intriguing affair has presented itself, one that promises to challenge even my little grey cells in ways I had not anticipated. I implore you to depart at your earliest convenience and join me at the Pera Palace Hotel, where I have taken rooms befitting the gravity of our investigation. Time is of the essence, mon ami. Your devoted friend Poirot, having served as Poirot's confidant and chronicler through numerous investigations, I had grown accustomed to such summons. Yet this particular request struck me as remarkable in its geographical ambition. Istanbul, that ancient crossroads where Europe meets Asia, where the ghosts of empires past still whisper among the minuets and bazaars. Whatever case had drawn my friend to those exotic shores must surely rank among the most fascinating of his career. Within 48 hours, I found myself aboard the Orient Express, that magnificent conveyance which had become synonymous with international intrigue and sophisticated travel. As the familiar landscapes of Europe gradually gave way to the more exotic vistas of the Ottoman domains, I found myself reflecting upon the singular nature of my friendship with Hercule Poirot. Our partnership, forged through shared adventures and mutual respect, had evolved into something approaching the relationship between a devoted chronicler and his subject. Though I flattered myself that my contributions extended beyond mere observation and documentation, the journey afforded me ample opportunity to speculate upon what manner of case might have attracted Poirot's attention in that distant corner of the civilized world. His reputation had spread far beyond the confines of London's criminal circles, and it was entirely possible that some wealthy expatriate or diplomatic personage had sought his assistance with a matter requiring his particular brand of methodical analysis. Yet something in the tone of his telegram suggested circumstances more complex than a simple case of theft or domestic discord. The train pulled into Seketsi station on a morning when the spring sun cast long dramatic shadows across the cobbled streets of what the locals still called Istanbul. The air was thick with unfamiliar scents, exotic spices, strong coffee, and that indefinable mixture of sea salt and antiquity that seems to permeate all great ports where civilizations have mingled for centuries. As I made my way through the bustling crowds toward the Galata Bridge, my luggage following in the capable hands of a cheerful porter, who spoke a fascinating mixture of Turkish, French, and what I took to be Greek, I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation that invariably accompanied the beginning of one of Poirot's more intriguing investigations. The Pera Palace Hotel stood like a bastion of European civilization in this sea of oriental splendor, its belly elegance offering reassuring familiarity to travelers fresh from the comforts of Paris or London. The uniformed doorman, whose English proved impeccable, directed me with courteous efficiency to the famous lift, that mechanical marvel which had made the hotel a byword for modernity throughout the continent. As I ascended to the third floor, I reflected upon how perfectly suited such surroundings were to serve as headquarters for a pro-investigation. Comfortable and civilized, yet positioned at the very heart of mystery and international intrigue, I discovered my friend in his suite, standing at the tall windows that commanded a magnificent view of the Golden Horn. He was immaculately dressed, as always, his morning coat pressed to absolute perfection, and his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the dusty streets through which he must surely have walked during his explorations of the city. Upon the writing desk beside him lay several detailed maps of Istanbul, marked with his characteristic precise annotations in purple ink, a sight that immediately informed me that his famous little grey cells were already working energetically upon whatever problem had summoned him to this ancient metropolis. "Ah, Mongbong Hastings," he exclaimed, turning from the window with evident pleasure. "You have made excellent time. I trust the journey was not too fatiguing for a gentleman of your years and disposition." "Not at all, Poirot," I replied, grasping his small, well-manicured, and with genuine warmth, though I confess myself consumed with curiosity about this mysterious summons. "Your telegram was remarkably brief, even by your famously economical standards." "Precise is him all, my friend," he said with a slight smile. "There are some matters that require the most delicate handling, and the telegraphic wires, they are not always as discreet as one might wish. The walls, as they say, have ears, and in a city such as this, where east meets west, and ancient secrets lie buried beneath every street, one cannot be too cautious in one's communications." He gestured toward a chair, upholstered in rich burgundy velvet, positioned to take advantage of both the morning light and the spectacular view beyond the windows. As I settled myself comfortably, Poirot moved with characteristic precision to pour coffee from an ornate Ottoman service that had clearly been provided by the hotel's evidently excellent kitchen. The aroma was rich and complex, bearing little resemblance to the more familiar brews of London's clubs and coffee-houses. 3 days ago, Poirot began, his green eyes taking on that peculiar intensity that I had learned to associate with the most serious and challenging of his cases, I received a most unexpected visit from Inspector Kamal Bey of the Istanbul police force. A most interesting gentleman, Hastings, educated at the Sorbonne, speaking excellent French, and possessed of that rarest of qualities in a member of any constabulary, imagination tempered by rigorous skepticism. "And what brought this Inspector Kamal to seek your assistance?" "A death, mon ami. A most peculiar and deeply disturbing death that has confounded the local authorities and set the entire expatriate community talking." Poirot's voice dropped to that grave, measured tone he invariably employed when discussing matters of life and death. "An English archaeologist, one Sir Lionel Harcourt, a gentleman of considerable reputation in academic circles, was discovered 3 mornings past in the ancient Byzantine systems that lie beneath the Sultan Ahmed district. He was found by torchlight in the early hours of dawn, his face frozen in an expression of what witnesses have described as absolute, unmitigated terror. I felt a distinct chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the Turkish sun streaming through the windows. Good heavens, how did the poor fellow meet his end? "Ah, that is precisely where the matter assumes its most intriguing and puzzling aspects," replied, moving once again to his position at the window where he stood, gazing out at the forest of minarets that punctuated the city's ancient skyline. "The local population, they whisper with genuine fear of something they call the ghost of Istanbul, a spirit that, according to their most cherished legends, haunts and ultimately destroys those who would dare to disturb the buried secrets of this most ancient and mysterious city. Surely you don't mean to suggest that I, Hercule, give credence to tales of supernatural vengeance, mon Dieu? No." His moustaches bristled with characteristic indignation at the very suggestion, "but I believe most profoundly in the infinite capacity of human beings to exploit superstition and fear as convenient masks for their crimes." Inspector Kamal, despite his modern education and rational outlook, admits to a certain uneasiness about this particular affair that goes beyond mere professional concern. I studied my friend's profile as he stood silhouetted against the bright window, noting something in his manner that suggested this case had affected him more deeply than his matter-of-fact words might indicate. There was a tension in his usually relaxed posture, a hint of genuine perplexity that I had rarely observed in our many adventures together. "The inspector has done me the considerable honor of requesting my assistance in this matter," Poirot continued, his voice carrying undertones of both professional pride and genuine concern. "The local authorities find themselves in a most delicate position, constrained as they are by the deeply held beliefs of the populace. They fear that too vigorous an investigation might be interpreted as showing disrespect to the spirits of the ancestors, a concern that, while perhaps superstitious, reflects genuine political wisdom in so cosmopolitan and historically complex a city. And you believe there is more to this tragedy than supernatural intervention?" "Messenmo." Poirot turned from the window with sudden decision, his entire bearing radiating that familiar energy that signaled the beginning of serious investigative work. When Hercule Poirot encounters what appears to be an impossible crime, disguised as supernatural vengeance, his little grey cells begin to work most energetically. Indeed, there are patterns to be discovered, connections to be made, and above all, human motives to be understood. As I rose to change from my travel-stained clothing into attire more suitable for whatever investigations lay ahead, Poirot returned to his careful study of the maps spread across his writing desk. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the purple ink of his annotations, creating patterns that seemed almost mystical in their precision and complexity, a fitting metaphor for the task that awaited us in the shadow depths of this ancient city, where the boundary between legend and reality had become dangerously blurred. Chapter 2. Descent into the Ancient Dark. Inspector Kamal Bey proved to be precisely as Poirot had described, a gentleman of middle years, whose intelligent dark eyes and measured bearing spoke of one who had witnessed much of the world beyond the confines of his native Constantinople. His English, though bearing the melodic cadences of his Turkish heritage, was both precise and thoughtful, revealing an education that had clearly extended far beyond the ordinary requirements of police work. In his manner, I detected that curious combination of modern skepticism and ancestral unease that seemed characteristic of educated men of his generation, who found themselves caught between the rational demands of contemporary life and the weight of centuries-old tradition. Our journey to the scene of Salionol's mysterious death took us through the labyrinthine streets of the old city, where the morning sun cast dramatic shadows between buildings that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. The motok car, a recent acquisition of the police department, as Inspector Kamal informed us with evident pride, navigated the narrow thoroughfares with considerable skill, though I noticed our driver crossed himself surreptitiously as we passed certain ancient structures whose significance I could only guess at. "Gentlemen," Inspector Kamal observed as we approached our destination, "I must warn you that what you are about to witness may prove somewhat disturbing to those unaccustomed to the more atmospheric aspects of our city's hidden places. The system, where Salionol met his unfortunate end, is not a location that welcomes casual visitors, and there are those among my colleagues who would prefer that it remain permanently sealed." The vehicle drew to a halt beside the towering mass of Hagia Sophia, that magnificent architectural testament to the city's layered history, its ancient domes seeming to brood over the surrounding streets like some vast protective presence. From this vantage point, Inspector Kamal led us through a series of increasingly narrow passages until we reached what appeared to be nothing more than an unremarkable stone building wedged between a carpet merchant's establishment and a diminutive cafe from which drifted the aromatic smoke of Turkish tobacco and the low murmur of conversation in several languages. "The entrance to the cistern," Inspector Kamal explained, producing from his coat pocket a heavy iron key of obviously considerable age, "has been sealed since the discovery of Salionol's body. We have taken great care to ensure that no one has been permitted to disturb the scene, though I must confess that maintaining such security in a city where every stone seems to conceal a secret passage has proven more challenging than one might expect." The door, when opened, revealed a steep stone staircase that plunged into what appeared to be absolute darkness. The air that rose to meet us carried the distinctive coolness of subterranean spaces, thick with moisture and redolent of centuries. There was something else in that atmosphere, a faintly sweet, cloying quality that made me instinctively draw a shallow breath and wonder what chemical processes might be at work in such an environment. Inspector Kamal lit a powerful electric torch, its beam carving a brilliant cone of white light into the Stygian depths below. As we began our careful descent, each footstep echoing with a hollow sound that spoke eloquently of vast spaces beyond the reach of our illumination, I found myself reflecting upon the countless generations who had traversed these same steps, each carrying their own purposes and secrets into the ancient dark. The staircase seemed to descend through geological ages as well as physical space, each step taking us further from the modern world above and deeper into a realm where time itself seemed to flow differently. When we finally emerged onto the floor of the system proper, I confess that the sight that greeted us left me momentarily speechless with wonder. Before us stretched what could only be described as a petrified forest, hundreds upon hundreds of columns disappearing into the darkness beyond our torchlight, each one carved with the exquisite skill of Byzantine master craftsmen and supporting graceful arches that soared overhead like the ribs of some colossal cathedral. The steady dripping of water from the vaulted ceiling created a sound like scattered applause, while our footsteps sent small ripples across the shallow pools that reflected our torchlight in wavering, hypnotic patterns. This particular system, Inspector Kamal explained, his voice taking on an almost reverential quality in the vast space, was constructed during the reign of Justinian, though it was forgotten for centuries until recent archaeological investigations brought it once again to light. There are dozens of such reservoirs beneath the old city, each one a testament to the engineering genius of our Byzantine ancestors. We moved deeper into this underground wonderland, our torch beam dancing across carved capitals adorned with elaborate foliage and weathered inscriptions in Greek script that spoke of glories long since faded. The atmosphere was simultaneously magnificent and oppressive. The sheer weight of history seemed to press upon one's consciousness with almost physical force, creating a sense of insignificance before the achievements of vanished civilizations. Here, Inspector Kamal announced, bringing our small procession to a halt. Beside a section where several columns had been surrounded by wooden scaffolding and an impressive array of archaeological equipment is where Salionel Harcourt was conducting his final excavations. Even in the uncertain light of our electric torch, the evidence of recent human activity was unmistakable. Buckets, brushes, measuring instruments, and carefully labeled containers lay scattered about in what spoke of either hasty abandonment or violent interruption. The ground showed clear signs of systematic excavation work with small trenches and carefully sorted piles of debris, indicating the methodical approach of a trained archaeologist. But it was the stark white chalk outline on the ancient stone floor that commanded our immediate and sobering attention. That familiar shape that police forces throughout the civilized world used to mark the final resting place of the dead. Salionol was discovered precisely there. Inspector Kamal continued, his voice dropping to a tone of professional gravity as he indicated the outlined figure by his local guide and translator, Theodosia Karakos, when he failed to return to the Pera Palace at his customary hour. The woman had grown concerned and searched through the night with the assistance of several local residents before venturing into the cistern at dawn. Poirot had moved away from our small group and was conducting his characteristic methodical examination of the scene. His diminutive figure, periodically illuminated by our torchlight as he moved about his work, appeared almost spectral in the ancient setting. I watched with familiar fascination as he employed that peculiar combination of scientific observation and intuitive understanding that had made his reputation throughout Europe. "The lantern," he called softly, his voice echoing strangely among the columns. "Where precisely was it discovered?" "Just there, Muro," Inspector Kamal replied, directing our attention to a spot approximately 3 feet from the chalk outline, completely extinguished, though it had been filled with fresh oil earlier that same evening, according to the hotel's records. "Tia," Poirot's characteristic exclamation, seemed to reverberate endlessly in the vast space. Most interesting indeed, and this expression of terror that has been so frequently mentioned, it was pronounced beyond any possibility of misinterpretation. Inspector Kamal's face grew grave. "Miss Poirot," I have been a police officer for more than 20 years, and in that time I have witnessed death in many forms, but never have I seen such absolute fear written upon a human countenance. It was as if Salianel had gazed upon something that challenged his very understanding of the natural world. The ghost of Istanbul, perhaps, Poirot suggested with apparent casualness. It was at that moment that a voice spoke from the shadows beyond our circle of torchlight, a voice rich and melodious, despite its unmistakable tremor of deep emotion. "The ghost is real, monsieur, as real as these ancient stones, and far more dangerous than any mortal enemy." We turned as one toward the source of this unexpected interruption, and Inspector Kamal raised his torch to reveal a woman of perhaps 45 years. Her dark hair, stray with premature silver, caught the light like polished metal, while her eyes reflected our torch beam with the depth and mystery of black water. She wore the practical clothing of one accustomed to archaeological fieldwork, but her bearing and manner of speech suggested education and cultural refinement that transcended mere professional competence. "Ah," said Inspector Kamal with evident relief. "Permit me to present Theodosia Karakos. She served as Sir Lionel's guide and translator during his researches here, and it was she who made the tragic discovery of his remains. As we stood in that ancient place, surrounded by the monuments of a vanished empire and the evidence of a modern tragedy, I found myself studying this woman's face with the careful attention that experience with Poirot had taught me to employ. There was something in her manner, a combination of genuine grief and what I could only describe as fatalistic acceptance, that suggested depths of knowledge not yet revealed to our investigation. Chapter 3. The Widow's Tale. Our ascent from the depths of the Byzantine cistern to the familiar comfort of the Pera Palace Hotel was accomplished in thoughtful silence, each member of our small party absorbed in contemplation of what we had witnessed in those ancient depths. The transition from that timeless underground cathedral to the elegant modernity of the hotel's marble-columned lobby seemed almost jarring in its abruptness, as if we had travelled not merely through physical space, but across the very centuries themselves, emerging from the shadowed past into the bright uncertainty of the present day. The curious circumstances of Salianol Harcourt's death had already begun to attract considerable attention among the expatriate community that made the Pera Palace its unofficial headquarters. As we passed through the lobby, I observed the discreet conversations that ceased upon our approach, the meaningful glances exchanged between well-dressed guests who clearly understood that we represented some official investigation into the affair that had set all of diplomatic Istanbul talking in hushed, excited tones. It was in the hotel's ornate Ottoman salon, that magnificent chamber with its gilt mirrors, reflecting infinite perspectives and Persian carpets, whose intricate patterns seemed to tell stories of their own, that Inspector Kamal had arranged for us to meet the various parties whose lives had become entangled with the deceased archaeologist's final expedition. As we settled ourselves in comfortable armchairs positioned near the tall windows that commanded a spectacular view of the Bosphorus, where merchant vessels and fishing boats pursued their eternal dance between two continents, I found myself applying that careful attention to detail which years of association with Hercule Poirot had taught me to employ when observing my fellow human beings. The first person to make her appearance was Lady Margaret Harcourt, and she entered the salon with a presence that would have commanded attention in any drawing-room from Mayfair to the courts of Europe. She was a woman of perhaps 45 years, possessed of that particular variety of refined beauty that improves rather than diminishes with the passage of time. Her auburn hair showed only the faintest threads of silver at the temples, arranged with a precision that spoke of considerable attention to personal appearance, even in her current circumstances. Her figure, draped in morning dress of the finest black silk that money could purchase, retained those elegant proportions that spoke of good breeding and careful attention to physical maintenance. Yet it was her bearing and deport that impressed me most profoundly upon this first encounter. Lady Margaret moved with the controlled grace of one thoroughly accustomed to the highest circles of society, her every gesture speaking of a lifetime spent navigating the complex social requirements of the British upper classes. Her composure, in the face of what must surely have been devastating personal loss, demonstrated a remarkable strength of character, suggesting depths of resilience that circumstances had clearly demanded she develop and employ. "Gentlemen," she said as Inspector Kamal performed the necessary introductions with the formal courtesy that such occasions required, "I am most grateful for your attention to this tragic matter, though I confess myself somewhat puzzled as to why the local authorities should require additional assistance in what appears so clearly to represent a supernatural occurrence beyond the scope of ordinary criminal investigation." Poirot's carefully maintained eyebrows rose slightly at this unexpected observation. "You believe, then, madame, in the authenticity of this ghost of Istanbul that has captured the imagination of the local population?" "I believe in evidence, Miss Poirot," Lady Margaret replied with admirable directness, settling herself with elegant precision into a chair upholstered in blue Damascus silk, whose colour complemented her pale complexion most favourably. "And the evidence, as I understand it, from the authorities' preliminary reports, suggests that my husband encountered something in those ancient chambers that no earthly agency could reasonably have produced. Perhaps you would be so kind as to enlighten us regarding your late husband's recent archaeological endeavours," Poirot requested, with that gentle insistence which I had learned to recognize as his method of encouraging confidences while appearing merely conversational. "We are given to understand that Salianel had made some discovery of particular significance in his current researches." A subtle transformation crossed Lady Margaret's features at this inquiry, and for the first time since her entrance, her carefully maintained composure seemed to waver slightly, revealing glimpses of the complex emotions that lay beneath her public facade. "Lionel was obsessed would perhaps not be too strong a term to employ," she began, her voice taking on a quality of remembered intensity. "For the past 18 months, he had been following what he described as a series of interconnected clues that he firmly believed would lead to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of our century, if not of any century since the Renaissance masters first began their systematic exploration of classical antiquity. And the nature of this discovery, madame, artifacts and inscriptions bearing direct connection to Constantine the Great himself," she replied, her voice warming with what I recognized as reflected enthusiasm for her husband's passion. Lionel had become convinced that he had uncovered references to what he termed a personal cache, items and treasures that the emperor had secreted away during the tumultuous early period of the city's founding, when political circumstances required the utmost discretion regarding the imperial household's most precious possessions. The historical implications of such a discovery were immediately apparent, and I found myself sharing something of the excitement that must have driven Salianel's final efforts. Yet, Poirot's next question brought our attention to more practical considerations. "The financial value of such a find, madame, had this been calculated?" Lady Margaret's carefully maintained composure tightened perceptibly at this direct inquiry into what were undoubtedly delicate family matters. However, her response demonstrated the same admirable frankness that had characterized her earlier statements. "I shall not attempt to deceive you on this point, Monsieur Poirot, as I suspect your investigation will reveal these facts, regardless of my personal preferences in the matter. My husband's archaeological researches had consumed our family's financial resources over the course of many years. We had been obliged to mortgage our estate in Yorkshire to dispose of family heirlooms that had been treasured for generations. This particular discovery represented not merely academic triumph, but quite literally our salvation from complete financial catastrophe. The candor of this admission struck me as both admirable and somewhat surprising, given the natural reluctance of persons of her social standing to discuss such intimate financial difficulties with relative strangers. Yet there remained something in her manner, a careful precision in her choice of words perhaps, that suggested reserves of information not yet disclosed. "Regarding the evening of your husband's death," Poirot continued with that same gentle persistence, "might I inquire as to your own whereabouts and activities during the relevant hours?" "Certainly. I dined here in this very salon with several other guests whose acquaintance I had made during our residence." "At the hotel," she responded without the slightest hesitation. "Mrs. Patterson, the wife of the American consul, and Colonel Whitmore, who travels in connection with the Imperial Ottoman Bank's local operations. Our dinner concluded at approximately 9, and I retired to my suite shortly thereafter, where I remained until receiving word of the tragic discovery the following morning. Had Sionel mentioned any particular appointment or engagement that evening, any specific reason for venturing into the system after darkness had fallen? For the first time, Lady Margaret appeared genuinely surprised by a question, and I sensed that we had touched upon some aspect of the affair that she had not fully considered. "He did seem unusually excited about something during our luncheon that day," she replied thoughtfully. "He mentioned that someone had contacted him regarding an inscription, some new discovery that might bear significantly upon his own researches. However, Lionel possessed a tendency toward secretiveness regarding his work until he had achieved absolute certainty regarding his conclusions." As Lady Margaret took her leave some minutes later, gliding from the salon with the same controlled grace that had marked her entrance, I found myself studying her retreating figure with distinctly troubled thoughts. Her account had been admirably straightforward, yet something in her carefully modulated responses suggested depths yet to be plumbed in this increasingly complex affair. Chapter 4. Rivals and Benefactors. The remainder of that afternoon brought a succession of characters to the elegant salon of the Pera Palace, each arrival adding fresh layers of complexity to what was already proving to be an investigation of considerable intricacy. As one who had spent many years observing the subtle interplay of human relationships in various social circles, I found myself peculiarly well positioned to appreciate the delicate tensions that existed among this particular assembly of individuals whose lives had become entangled with Sir Lionel Harcourt's final archaeological endeavours. The second person to present himself for Poirot's examination was Professor Rami Effendi, and his entrance alone provided considerable insight into the complicated cultural dynamics that surrounded our investigation. He was a man of perhaps 55 years, bearing himself with the dignified carriage of one who had devoted his life to scholarly pursuits while maintaining deep connections to his Turkish heritage. His Western-style dress was impeccable, yet something in his manner suggested the careful balance that educated men of his generation were obliged to maintain between the demands of international academic discourse and the profound cultural loyalties that shaped their fundamental world-view. "Messieurs," he began, speaking English with the precise formality of one for whom it represented a carefully acquired skill rather than a native tongue, "I understand that you are investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of Lionel Harcourt. While I naturally wish to assist the authorities in any manner possible, I must confess that I find certain aspects of this inquiry deeply troubling from the perspective of one who has devoted his career to the preservation of my country's historical patrimony." Professor Effendi's academic credentials were impressive. A doctorate from the Sion, extensive publication in archaeological journals throughout Europe, and a reputation for fierce intellectual integrity that had earned him respect even among those who disagreed with his increasingly nationalist positions regarding the disposition of Ottoman artifacts. Yet, it was precisely this combination of scholarly achievement and cultural passion that made him such a fascinating subject for observation. "You had concerns, then, regarding Salion's work?" Poirot inquired with that deceptively casual manner that often encouraged the most revealing confidences. "I had profound concerns about the systematic removal of our cultural treasures by foreign archaeologists who show little regard for the historical context from which these artifacts derive their true significance," Professor Effendi replied, his voice carrying undertones of barely controlled emotion. "Lionel was by no means the worst of his kind, but his recent discoveries threaten to perpetuate a pattern of cultural exploitation that has characterized European archaeological endeavors in our region for far too many decades." The passion with which he spoke was unmistakable, yet I observed that his hands trembled slightly when he mentioned the legendary curse that supposedly surrounded the system excavations. There was something in his manner that suggested his opposition to foreign archaeological activities was complicated by a genuine uneasiness regarding the supernatural elements that local tradition associated with such disturbances of the ancient past. Our next visitor provided a striking contrast to the professor's academic intensity. Captain Julian Rhodes entered the salon with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his tall, weathered frame and direct manner of address immediately marking him as a product of British military tradition. Yet beneath his assured exterior, I detected signs of the financial pressures that had apparently driven him to seek profit through archaeological speculation. "Gentlemen," he announced without preamble, "I understand you're looking into poor Harrot's death. Damned strange business, if you ask me, though I suppose there's bound to be a rational explanation once all the facts are known." Captain Rhodes had served with distinction in several of the Empire's more challenging colonial campaigns before retiring to pursue various business ventures with decidedly mixed success. His decision to finance Solian's recent excavations represented what he frankly acknowledged to be his final opportunity to avoid complete financial catastrophe. "The arrangement was straightforward enough," he explained, when Poirot inquired about the details of their partnership. "I provided the funding for equipment, permits, local labor, the sort of practical requirements that scholars tend to overlook when pursuing their theories. In exchange, I was to receive a substantial percentage of any profits from the sale of whatever artifacts might be discovered." The captain's financial situation was clearly precarious, and his investment in Salionol's work represented a considerable gamble based more on desperation than careful calculation. Yet there was something in his manner, a soldier's instinct for assessing dangerous situations, that suggested he had developed genuine concerns about the wisdom of continuing the excavations in the face of mounting local opposition. "Had been some incidents, you see," he continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of one accustomed to delivering military reports. "Local people following Hardcourt through the bazaars, hostile demonstrations near the excavation sites. The whole ghost business had the population considerably stirred up, and I'd begun to wonder whether the potential profits justified the risks we were running." The third member of our afternoon's cast of characters proved to be the most intriguing from the perspective of pure academic rivalry. Miss Evelyn Trent arrived precisely at the appointed hour, and her entrance immediately commanded attention through sheer force of intellectual presence rather than conventional feminine appeal. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years, possessed of that particular type of sharp, featured attractiveness that speaks of formidable intelligence and barely concealed ambition. Miss Trent's credentials were impressive by any standard. A fellow of Girton College, Cambridge, with extensive field experience in archaeological excavations throughout the Mediterranean region. Her current presence in Istanbul was ostensibly connected to her own research into Byzantine religious artifacts. Yet, something in her manner suggested motivations that extended beyond purely scholarly interests. I must confess that Sionel's recent claims regarding his discoveries had aroused considerable skepticism within certain circles of the archaeological community. She observed with a sort of precisely calibrated diplomatic language that academic rivalries often employ to mask more fundamental disagreements. His theories regarding Constantine's personal treasure cache struck many of us as rather too convenient, given his well-known financial difficulties. The implications of her statement were clear enough, though delivered with sufficient subtlety to avoid direct accusation of scholarly fraud. Miss Trent's own career had been overshadowed by Salion's more spectacular discoveries, and there was an unmistakable note of professional jealousy in her carefully modulated criticisms of his recent work. "Had you examined any of the materials that Sir Lionel claimed to have discovered?" Poirot asked with apparent casual interest. He was remarkably secretive about sharing his findings with other scholars, Miss Trent replied, and for the first time her composed facade showed signs of genuine irritation. Despite repeated requests from myself and others, he insisted on conducting his analysis in complete isolation, claiming that premature disclosure might compromise the integrity of his research. This pattern of secrecy had apparently frustrated several members of the archaeological community, creating tensions that went beyond mere professional disagreement. Miss Trent's presence in Istanbul during the final weeks of Salion's work was clearly no coincidence, though her exact motivations remained tantalizingly unclear. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Golden Horn and our various interviews concluded, I found myself reflecting upon the complex web of relationships that had surrounded the deceased archaeologist during his final days. Each of our visitors had possessed both motive and opportunity to wish Salion ill, yet none had exhibited the sort of obvious guilt that might simplify our investigation. Instead, we were left with a collection of individuals whose public statements concealed depths of private motivation that would require considerable skill to illuminate. The ghost of Istanbul had apparently struck down a man whose life had become entangled with academic rivalries, financial desperation, and cultural conflicts that reflected the broader tensions of our changing world. Whether supernatural vengeance or human malice had ultimately claimed Sir Lionel High Court remained to be determined, but the complexity of the circumstances suggested that Hercule Poirot's famous little grey cells would face a challenge worthy of their reputation. Chapter 5. The Science of Superstition. The following morning found Poirot in a most contemplative mood, his breakfast consumed with the sort of methodical precision that invariably characterized his approach to complex problems. I observed him from across our shared table in the hotel's elegant dining room, noting how his green eyes moved with systematic attention between the various Turkish newspapers spread before him and the detailed notes he had compiled during our previous day's interviews. The morning light streaming through the tall windows that overlooked the Bosphorus seemed to illuminate not merely his familiar features, but that peculiar quality of intellectual intensity that marked the beginning of his most serious investigative efforts. "Mon ami," he observed, without looking up from his careful study of what appeared to be a medical report written in French. "I find myself increasingly convinced that the supernatural explanation for Salianol's demise serves primarily to obscure rather than illuminate the true circumstances of his death. The human mind. It has a remarkable capacity for accepting mysterious explanations when the mundane truth proves too uncomfortable for contemplation. My own background as a military officer had provided me with considerable experience in observing the effects of various forms of violence upon the human frame. Yet, I confess that the specific symptoms described in the preliminary police reports regarding Salian's condition struck me as distinctly unusual. The victim's posture at the time of discovery, clutching at his chest in apparent agony, combined with his expression of absolute terror, suggested something beyond ordinary physical assault or even conventional poisoning. "What manner of consultation are you pursuing this morning?" I inquired, noting the official seal upon several of the documents that littered our table. "Dr. Mahmoud Pasha, the city's most distinguished physician, and a gentleman whose medical education encompasses both European scientific methods and extensive familiarity with the various toxicological traditions of the Orient," Poirot replied, finally raising his eyes to meet mine with that characteristic directness that always accompanied his most significant revelations. "His preliminary examination of Salianol's remains has yielded observations of considerable interest to our investigation. The doctor's report, as Poirot subsequently explained, confirmed several crucial details that had emerged during our examination of the crime scene. The victim's symptoms, the rigid posture, the expression of terror, the apparent respiratory distress pointed clearly toward some form of chemical poisoning rather than supernatural intervention. More specifically, the evidence suggested exposure to a gaseous toxin that had produced rapid onset of symptoms culminating in cardiac arrest. "Most interesting of all, Hastings," Rowe continued, his voice taking on that particular quality of satisfaction that marked significant progress in his deductive process, "is Dr. Mahmoud's observation regarding the distinctive odor that apparently lingered in the vicinity of the body. The scent of bitter almonds, though faint, was unmistakable to one trained in the recognition of various toxic substances. This detail immediately brought to mind my rudimentary knowledge of poisonous compounds gleaned from military service in regions where such information possessed practical value. The almond scent suggested cyanide, though the mechanism by which such a substance might have been administered in the confines of an ancient system remained puzzling. Our morning's investigations took us next to the modest establishment that served as Salianol's archaeological workshop, a ground-F floor space in one of the newer buildings near the Galata district that had been equipped with the various scientific instruments and reference materials necessary for the analysis of historical artifacts. The proprietor, an elderly Greek gentleman named Stavros, who had clearly developed considerable respect for British archaeological methods, welcomed us with the sort of deferential courtesy that suggested both genuine admiration for scholarly pursuits and shrewd appreciation for the commercial benefits of maintaining good relationships with foreign researchers. The workshop itself proved to be a fascinating study in the intersection of ancient mysteries and modern scientific methodology. Tables laden with carefully catalogued pottery fragments, stone inscriptions, and metalwork bore witness to the systematic approach that had characterized Salion's recent efforts. More significantly for our purposes, however, were the various chemical supplies that had been employed in the preservation and analysis of archaeological specimens. Sir Lionel, he was most particular about his scientific methods, Stavros explained in heavily accented English, gesturing toward an impressive array of bottles, retorts, and measuring devices. Always he insisted upon the proper chemical treatment for cleaning and preserving the old things. Very learned gentleman, very careful with the dangerous materials. Poirot's examination of these supplies revealed an extensive collection of acids, solvents, and other substances whose proper handling required considerable expertise. Of particular interest were several compounds that could prove lethal if misused, including materials that might conceivably be employed to generate toxic gases under appropriate circumstances. "You observe, Hastings," Poirot murmured, as he examined a collection of chemical bottles with his characteristic attention to detail, that our archaeologist possessed both the knowledge and the materials necessary to create a most effective poison gas. Should such a course of action have occurred to him, the question that presents itself is whether he might have been the victim of his own scientific expertise employed against him by one who understood both his methods and his movements. This line of reasoning proved particularly intriguing when we discovered that Salion had not been the only archaeologist to make use of these facilities. Miss Evelyn Trent, according to Stavros, had been a frequent visitor to the workshop during the weeks preceding the tragedy, ostensibly for the purpose of consulting various reference works and occasionally borrowing equipment for her own research projects. The lady, she understood much about the chemical methods, the proprietor observed, with evident admiration. Often she would discuss with Salion the proper techniques for analyzing old metal objects and stone carvings. Very learned conversation, though sometimes they would disagree about the interpretation of results. The implications of Miss Trent's familiarity with both the workshop's chemical supplies and Sionel's research methods had not escaped Pooh's attention. Her expertise in archaeological chemistry, combined with her obvious professional rivalry with the deceased, suggested possibilities that warranted careful consideration. Moreover, her detailed knowledge of the local excavation sites acquired through her own research activities would have provided her with the sort of geographical familiarity that might prove essential for planning a crime in the labyrinthine passages beneath the old city. Our afternoon was devoted to a careful exploration of the legendary foundations upon which the ghost of Istanbul had built its fearsome reputation among the local population. Theodosia Karakos, despite her obvious uneasiness regarding what she clearly considered dangerous inquiries into supernatural matters, proved to be an invaluable guide to the complex folklore that surrounded the ancient systems and their supposed otherworldly inhabitants. "The stories, they go back many generations," she explained, as we sat in a traditional coffee house near the Grand Bazaar, where the aromatic smoke of water pipes provided an appropriately atmospheric backdrop for her recounting of local traditions. "Always there have been deaths in the old places beneath the city. Strange deaths that could not be explained by ordinary means. People would venture into the cisterns and emerge, speaking of terrible smells, of voices in the darkness, of visions that drove them to madness. The historical record, as Theodosia related it, contained numerous accounts of mysterious fatalities associated with the underground excavations that had proceeded intermittently over the centuries. In many cases, the symptoms described bore remarkable similarity to those that had characterized Salion's final moments. Sudden onset of respiratory distress, expressions of extreme terror, and the persistent presence of unusual odor that defied ready explanation. "But what strikes me as most significant, Mummy," Poirot observed as we made our way back to the hotel through streets where the lengthening shadows of late afternoon created patterns of light and darkness that seemed to mirror the complexity of our investigation, "is not the supernatural elements of these stories, but rather their scientific accuracy in describing the effects of certain chemical compounds upon the human system. It would appear that someone with considerable knowledge of both local folklore and modern toxicology has drawn upon both traditions to create a most effective method of murder. The evening found us in Poirot's suite, where he had arranged the various pieces of evidence and testimony in the systematic fashion that always preceded his most brilliant deductive efforts. The physical materials, photographs of the crime scene, chemical analysis reports, witness statements lay spread across the writing desk in patterns that spoke of his methodical approach to unraveling complex mysteries. As I observed my friend's preparations for what I sensed would prove to be the crucial phase of our investigation, I found myself reflecting upon the peculiar circumstances that had brought us to this ancient crossroads between East and West, where the accumulated wisdom of centuries had become entangled with the ambitions and rivalries of our modern age. The ghost of Istanbul, whether supernatural entity or human creation, had chosen its victim with precision and struck with a sophistication that suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of both the scientific principles involved and the cultural context that would provide the perfect camouflage for the murder. Chapter 6. Footprints in the Mud. The curious circumstances surrounding the death of Sir Lionel Harcourt had by this point begun to assume a complexity that would have challenged even the most experienced investigator. As a retired military officer with considerable experience in observing the subtle patterns that often reveal themselves in seemingly chaotic situations, I found myself increasingly fascinated by the methodical manner in which Poirot was extracting order from what had initially appeared to be an inexplicable supernatural occurrence. The morning of our fourth day in Istanbul found my friend in a particularly focused frame of mind, his breakfast consumed with the sort of mechanical precision that invariably preceded his most intensive periods of deductive analysis. He had spent the previous evening in careful study of the various physical evidence that had been collected from the crime scene, approaching each detail with the systematic thoroughness that had made his reputation throughout the criminal investigation circles of Europe. "Mon ami," he observed as we prepared to return once more to the scene of Salionol's mysterious demise, "I find myself increasingly convinced that the answer to this puzzle lies not in supernatural intervention, but in the careful application of scientific principles by one who possesses both the knowledge and the motivation to employ them for murderous purposes. Our descent into the Byzantine system on this occasion was undertaken with a specific purpose that had emerged from Poirot's detailed analysis of the crime scene photographs. Inspector Kemal, who had proven himself to be a most capable collaborator, despite his obvious uneasiness regarding the legendary aspects of our investigation, had arranged for the installation of additional electric lighting that would permit a more thorough examination of the physical evidence than had been possible during our initial visit. The forest of ancient columns, illuminated now by the steady glow of electric bulbs strung along temporary cables, presented a markedly different aspect from the shadowy torch-lit cavern we had first encountered. The improved visibility revealed details that had previously escaped our attention: subtle variations in the stone flooring, patterns of water damage and mineral deposits that spoke of centuries of gradual change, and most significantly for our purposes, a series of marks and impressions in the accumulated sediment that bore witness to recent human activity. It was these footprints that commanded Poirot's immediate and sustained attention, using techniques that he had apparently acquired through correspondence with certain French criminologists who specialized in the scientific analysis of physical evidence. He proceeded to make careful measurements and detailed sketches of the various impressions that marked the route between the system's entrance and the location where Salionel's body had been discovered. "Observe, if you please, Hastings," he said, crouching beside a particularly clear set of impressions near the chalk outline that still marked the victim's final resting place. "These footprints tell a most interesting story for those who possess the knowledge to interpret their significance." The analysis that followed demonstrated once again the remarkable precision with which Poirot could extract crucial information from seemingly insignificant details. The pattern of impressions revealed not one but several distinct sets of footprints, suggesting that Salional had not been alone in the system during his final hours. More significantly, the depth and clarity of certain impressions indicated that at least one person had moved through the area with considerable familiarity, avoiding the softer patches of sediment that would have left deeper tracks, while following a route that suggested intimate knowledge of the underground passages. The murderer, Poirot explained as he completed his measurements, possessed detailed knowledge of this subterranean landscape. Observe how these prints follow the firmest ground, avoiding the areas where deeper impressions would have been left. This speaks of someone who had spent considerable time exploring these passages, mapping their layout, and identifying the most efficient routes through the labyrinthine spaces. The implications of this discovery were immediately apparent. Among our suspects, only those individuals who had been involved in archaeological work in the area would have possessed the sort of detailed familiarity with the system's geography that the footprint evidence suggested. Miss Evelyn Trent's own research activities had apparently brought her into these underground spaces on numerous occasions, providing her with precisely the sort of specialized knowledge that would have been essential for the careful planning and execution of such a crime. Our investigation took a decidedly scientific turn as Poirot employed his considerable knowledge of chemistry to reconstruct the probable sequence of events that had led to Sir Lionel's death. The evidence pointed toward a method of remarkable sophistication, the deliberate generation of hydrogen cyanide gas through a controlled chemical reaction that had been designed to take advantage of the closed environment of the system. The killer, Poirot explained as we examined the various chemical residues that his analysis had revealed in the vicinity of the crime scene, employed a technique that required both extensive scientific knowledge and careful advanced preparation. The materials necessary for such a reaction would have been readily available to anyone with access to the archaeological workshop, yet the practical application demanded considerable expertise in the handling of dangerous substances. The beauty of the method from a criminal perspective lay in its apparent impossibility. The generation of toxic gas in a confined space, followed by the natural dispersal of the evidence through the system's ventilation systems, would have left little physical proof of deliberate murder. Only the lingering scent of bitter almonds, detected by the sharp senses of the examining physician, had provided the crucial clue that pointed toward human agency rather than supernatural intervention. Miss Trent's expertise in archaeological chemistry, documented through her published research and confirmed by her frequent use of the workshop facilities, positioned her as the individual most capable of conceiving and executing such a sophisticated murder method. Her familiarity with the local excavation sites acquired through months of personal exploration had provided her with the geographical knowledge necessary to navigate the underground passages and identify the optimal location for her deadly experiment. The motive that had driven her to such desperate measures emerged from our careful analysis of the academic rivalries that had characterized the archaeological community's response to Lionel's recent discoveries. His announcement regarding the Constantine treasure had threatened to eclipse her own career achievements permanently, transforming her from a respected scholar into a footnote in archaeological history. For one whose entire professional identity depended upon academic recognition and scholarly reputation, such a prospect represented a form of professional death that might well justify actual murder. The psychological profile that Poirot constructed revealed an individual whose combination of scientific brilliance and professional desperation had created the perfect conditions for a crime of remarkable complexity. Miss Trent's careful cultivation of the supernatural explanation, her strategic use of local folklore to provide camouflage for her scientific method, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that went far beyond mere academic training. The ghost of Istanbul, Poirot observed, as we prepared to leave the cistern after completing our detailed examination of the physical evidence, was indeed a creation of human intelligence, though not in the manner that local tradition would suggest. Our murderer employed the city's legendary reputation to provide the perfect cover for a crime that represented the intersection of ancient superstition and modern scientific knowledge. The timing of the murder had been chosen with equal care, taking advantage of Lionel's secretive working methods and his tendency to pursue promising leads without informing others of his specific plans. Miss Trent's message, purporting to reveal a new inscription of potential significance to his research, had provided the perfect lure to draw him into the isolated environment where her carefully prepared trap awaited. As we emerged from the underground world of Byzantine engineering into the familiar bustle of Istanbul's modern streets, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable fusion of old and new that had characterized this most unusual crime. The ancient systems built to serve the practical needs of a vanished empire had become the stage for a thoroughly contemporary drama of professional rivalry and scientific murder. The ghost of Istanbul, stripped of its supernatural mystery, revealed itself to be a creation of human ambition and intellectual pride, forces that proved every bit as destructive as any legendary curse. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The peculiar art of criminal investigation, as I had learned through my long association with Hercule Poirot, often resembles the patient work of an archaeologist, each carefully excavated detail contributing to a larger pattern that emerges only through systematic examination of seemingly disconnected fragments. As we entered what I sensed would prove to be the crucial phase of our Istanbul investigation, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable transformation that had occurred in my understanding of the circumstances surrounding Sir Lionel Harcourt's death. What had begun as an apparently supernatural occurrence shrouded in the mystical traditions of an ancient city had gradually revealed itself to be a crime of thoroughly modern sophistication. The ghost that haunted the Byzantine systems was indeed real, but it existed in the calculating mind of a murderer whose scientific knowledge had been employed with deadly precision to create the illusion of otherworldly vengeance. The morning of our 5th day in Istanbul found Poirot in that particular state of focused intensity that invariably preceded his most brilliant revelations. He had spent the previous evening in careful review of all the evidence we had gathered, arranging and rearranging the various pieces of testimony and physical proof, with the methodical precision of a master chess player contemplating the decisive moves of an endgame. I observed him from my position near the windows of our suite, noting how his green eyes moved with systematic attention between his notebook and the detailed floor plans of the system that he had sketched during our investigation. "Mon ami," he announced without raising his gaze from his papers, "I believe the moment has arrived to test certain theories that have emerged from our inquiries. The time has come to observe how our various suspects respond when confronted with uncomfortable truths about their activities during the period surrounding Salionol's death." The strategy that Poirot employed in the hours that followed demonstrated once again his profound understanding of human psychology and the delicate art of extracting crucial information through seemingly casual conversation. Rather than conducting formal interrogations that might have prompted defensive responses, he chose instead to orchestrate a series of apparently coincidental encounters that would allow him to observe the natural reactions of our suspects when presented with carefully selected revelations about the progress of our investigation. Our first opportunity arose during the morning promenade hour when the fashionable residents of the Pera Palace traditionally gathered in the hotel's elegant lobby to exchange gossip and conduct the subtle social negotiations that formed the backbone of expatriate community life. Miss Evelyn Trent was present, as Poirot had anticipated, engaged in earnest conversation with several members of the archaeological community who had gathered to discuss the implications of Salion's death for ongoing research activities in the region. "Ah, Miss Trent," Poirot observed with apparent casualness as we approached her group, "I trust you have found time to continue your own research despite the tragic circumstances that have disrupted the scholarly community here. I understand that your work on Byzantine religious artifacts has required extensive exploration of the city's underground spaces." The effect of this seemingly innocent observation was immediate and telling. Miss Trent's composure, which had remained admirably controlled during our formal interview, showed the first signs of strain as she realized the implications of Poirot's comment. Her knowledge of the system, which she had undoubtedly hoped would remain a private matter, had clearly become a subject of official interest. "I have indeed spent considerable time studying the archaeological significance of various subterranean sites," she replied with careful precision, though I detected a subtle tension in her voice that had not been present during our previous encounter. The preservation of artifacts in such environments often provides unique insights into historical practices and religious traditions. Prime Poo agreed with apparent enthusiasm, and I imagine that such extensive exploration would have provided you with remarkable familiarity with the geography of these underground spaces. One might almost say that you could navigate them with your eyes closed, n'est-ce pas? The colour that rose to Miss Trent's cheeks at this suggestion provided eloquent testimony to the accuracy of Poirot's deduction. Her intimate knowledge of the system passages acquired through months of personal exploration had indeed enabled her to move through those shadowy spaces with the confidence of one thoroughly familiar with every column and archway. Our next encounter was with Captain Rhodes, whom we discovered in the hotel's smoking room, engaged in morose contemplation of his financial difficulties over a glass of brandy that suggested the early hour had not deterred him from seeking liquid consolation for his troubles. The captain's military background had provided him with the sort of practical knowledge that might have proved useful in planning a complex operation. Yet our investigation had revealed crucial gaps in his understanding of the scientific principles that would have been essential for the method employed in Sir Lionel's murder. Captain Poirot observed as we joined him at his secluded table. "I understand that your partnership with Sir Lionel had reached a critical juncture in recent weeks. The success or failure of his current excavations would have determined your own financial future, would it not?" Captain Rhodes regarded us with the steady gaze of one accustomed to facing uncomfortable truths with military directness. "That's putting it rather bluntly. But yes, I was rather counting on Harcourt's discoveries to pull me out of a decidedly tight spot. His death has left me in a most precarious position, financially speaking. Yet you had begun to have concerns about the wisdom of continuing the excavations given the local opposition and the supernatural elements that seem to surround the work. A soldier learns to recognize when a situation is becoming untenable," the captain replied, with a frankness that I found rather admirable under the circumstances. The local population was becoming increasingly hostile, and there were incidents that suggested our activities were attracting the wrong sort of attention. I'd begun to wonder whether discretion might not prove the better part of valor. This conversation served to confirm our assessment that Captain Rhodes, while certainly possessing adequate motive for murder, lacked both the scientific expertise and the detailed knowledge of local conditions that would have been necessary for the sophisticated crime that had claimed Sir Lionel's life. His straightforward military mentality was ill-suited to the sort of elaborate deception that had characterized the murder, and his obvious financial desperation would have inclined him toward more direct methods of resolving his difficulties. The crucial test of our theories came during an apparently chance encounter with Professor Rami Effendi in the lobby of the hotel, where he was engaged in animated discussion with several Turkish officials regarding the cultural implications of foreign archaeological activities. The professor's passionate nationalism and his genuine concern for the preservation of Ottoman heritage had provided him with both motive and opportunity. Yet our investigation had revealed certain inconsistencies in his behavior that suggested complexities beyond mere patriotic fervor. Professor Poirot observed with his characteristic directness, "I have been most impressed by your extensive knowledge of the local folklore surrounding the ghost of Istanbul. Your familiarity with the traditional stories associated with the ancient cisterns suggests considerable research into these matters." Professor Effendi's response to this observation revealed the fundamental contradiction that had puzzled us throughout our investigation. Despite his passionate opposition to foreign archaeological activities and his profound respect for local traditions, his academic training had left him fundamentally skeptical of supernatural explanations for observable phenomena. His trembling hands, when discussing the legendary ghost, reflected not genuine fear of other-worldly intervention, but rather the anxiety of one who recognized that human agency lay behind what others attributed to spiritual vengeance. "The old stories serve important cultural functions," he replied with careful diplomatic language. "Even when one approaches them from a strictly academic perspective, they reflect the accumulated wisdom of generations and deserve respectful consideration, regardless of one's personal beliefs regarding their literal accuracy." This conversation confirmed our growing conviction that Professor Effendi possessed both the motivation and the intellectual capacity for complex planning. His fundamental honesty and academic integrity made him an unlikely candidate for the sort of elaborate deception that had characterized Sir Lionel's murder. His nationalism, however passionate, operated within ethical boundaries that would have precluded such extreme measures. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Golden Horn, and we prepared for what I sensed would prove to be the final phase of our investigation, I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable skill with which Poirot had orchestrated these seemingly casual encounters. Each conversation had served to eliminate certain possibilities while confirming others, gradually narrowing our focus to the individual whose combination of scientific knowledge, geographical familiarity, and psychological motivation had made possible the creation of the Ghost of Istanbul. Chapter 8. The Final Curtain. The evening of our 5th day in Istanbul brought with it that peculiar atmosphere of anticipation that invariably accompanies the conclusion of one of Poirot's more complex investigations. As a gentleman who had witnessed numerous such occasions during my long association with the little Belgian detective, I found myself observing the assembled company in the Pera Palace's magnificent Ottoman salon with the sort of heightened attention that comes from knowing that momentous revelations are about to unfold. The salon itself seemed particularly well suited to serve as the stage for Poirot's dramatic denouement. The rich burgundy velvet of the upholstered furniture, the intricate patterns of the Persian carpets, and the soft gleam of gilt-framed mirrors created an atmosphere of elegant sophistication that provided the perfect backdrop for what I had come to recognize as one of my friend's most masterful performances. The assembled guests for Inspector Kemal had, at Poirot's request, gathered all the principal figures in our investigation, occupied their seats with the sort of nervous expectancy that suggested each individual was acutely aware that the evening would bring either vindication or exposure. Lady Margaret Harcourt had positioned herself near the tall windows that overlooked the Bosphorus, her black morning dress creating a stark silhouette against the fading light of the Turkish sunset. Despite the composed dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout our investigation, I detected in her manner a subtle tension that spoke of profound anxiety regarding what revelations the evening might bring. Her financial circumstances, so frankly acknowledged during our earlier conversation, had certainly provided adequate motive for the crime. Yet something in her fundamental character had consistently struck me as incompatible with the sort of elaborate deception that had characterized her husband's murder. Professor Rami Effendi occupied a chair positioned to command a view of the entire assembly, his scholarly bearing and careful attention to the proceedings reflecting both intellectual curiosity and professional concern for the outcome of our investigation. His passionate nationalism and genuine distress at the exploitation of Turkish archaeological treasures had certainly provided him with compelling motivation to eliminate Sir Lionel. Yet our careful analysis had revealed crucial gaps in both his scientific knowledge and his familiarity with the practical details that would have been essential for the sophisticated method employed in the murder. Captain Julian Rhodes sat somewhat apart from the others, his military bearing apparent even in repose, yet his obvious financial desperation and the frank manner in which he had acknowledged his precarious circumstances had marked him as a suspect whose motives were entirely transparent. His straightforward personality and conventional approach to problem-solving had consistently struck me as fundamentally incompatible with the sort of creative thinking that would have been necessary to conceive and execute such an elaborate scheme. Miss Evelyn Trent had chosen a seat that afforded her an excellent view of Poirot while positioning her back toward one of the room's elegant marble columns, a choice that struck me as either unconsciously defensive or deliberately calculated to provide psychological comfort during what she must surely have recognized would prove to be a challenging evening. Her academic credentials and scientific expertise had positioned her from the beginning as our most capable suspect. Yet she had maintained throughout our investigation a facade of scholarly detachment that had made it difficult to assess her true emotional state. Theodosia Karakos, whose discovery of Sir Lionel's body had initiated our entire investigation, occupied a chair near the fireplace, where the soft light seemed to accentuate the premature silver in her dark hair and the lines of care that marked her face. Her genuine belief in the supernatural explanation for the death, combined with her intimate knowledge of local folklore and traditions, had provided crucial insights into the cultural context that the murderer had exploited with such devastating effectiveness. Poirot himself had positioned himself in the center of the assembled company, his small figure commanding attention through sheer force of personality rather than physical presence. He had donned his most formal evening attire for the occasion, his patent leather shoes gleaming, and his mustaches waxed to absolute perfection. A sartorial choice that reflected both his respect for the gravity of the proceedings and his appreciation for the theatrical elements that characterized his most memorable revelations. "Madame and Monsieur," he began, his voice carrying easily throughout the elegant salon. "We are gathered this evening to discuss the tragic death of Salyan al-Harcourt and to lay to rest once and for all the legend of the ghost of Istanbul that has cast such a shadow over the archaeological community of this ancient and fascinating city." The silence that followed this opening statement seemed to press upon the assembled company with almost physical weight, each individual maintaining their composure while clearly struggling with private anxieties regarding what the evening's revelations might bring. "From the beginning of our investigation," Poirot continued, his green eyes moving systematically from face to face as he spoke, "I have been struck by the remarkable sophistication of the method employed in this crime. The creation of a gaseous poison in the confined environment of an ancient system, combined with the strategic exploitation of local supernatural beliefs to provide camouflage for the murder, required a combination of scientific knowledge, geographical familiarity, and psychological insight that narrowed our field of suspects considerably." Miss Trent's composure, which had remained admirably controlled throughout our investigation, showed the first signs of genuine strain, as Poirot's methodical analysis began to focus upon the technical aspects of the crime. Her hands, I observed, had developed a slight tremor that she attempted to conceal by clasping them tightly in her lap. "The footprint evidence from the crime scene," Poirot continued with relentless precision, "revealed that the murderer possessed intimate knowledge of the system's geography, knowledge that could only have been acquired through extensive personal exploration of these underground spaces. More significantly, the chemical analysis of residues found near the victim's body confirmed that the toxic gas was generated through a controlled reaction involving compounds readily available in any well-equipped archaeological laboratory. The method by which the crime had been accomplished, as Poirot proceeded to explain with characteristic thoroughness, represented a masterpiece of criminal planning that had taken advantage of Salyanal's secretive working methods and his tendency to pursue promising leads without informing others of his specific intentions. The message that had lured him to the cistern, purporting to reveal a new inscription of potential significance to his research, had provided the perfect means of drawing him into the isolated environment where the murderer's carefully prepared trap awaited. The motive, Poirot observed, his gaze now fixed directly upon Miss Trent's increasingly pale features, lay in professional jealousy of the most destructive kind. So Lionel's announcement regarding his discovery of artifacts connected to Constantine the Great threatened to eclipse permanently the career of a rival whose entire professional identity depended upon academic recognition and scholarly reputation. Miss Trent's final facade crumbled under the weight of Poirot's inexorable logic, her confession emerging in a torrent of bitter words that revealed the depths of resentment and professional frustration that had driven her to murder. Her expertise in archaeological chemistry had provided her with both the knowledge and the means to create what appeared to be a supernatural death, while her familiarity with local folklore had suggested the perfect method of concealing her crime behind the veil of ancient superstition. "The ghost of Istanbul," Poirot concluded, as Inspector Kemmel's officers moved to arrest the confessed murderess, "was indeed a creation of human intelligence, not the vengeful spirit of legend, but the calculated malice of one woman who chose to cloak herself in the garb of superstition rather than accept the limitations of her own scholarly achievements." As Miss Trent was led away into the Turkish night, her academic career destroyed by the very ambition that had driven her to seek scholarly immortality through murder, I found myself reflecting upon the curious ways in which the ancient and modern worlds had intersected in this most unusual case. The Byzantine cisterns would return to their peaceful slumber, the tourists would continue to marvel at their engineering genius, and the ghost of Istanbul would fade back into the realm of folklore where it properly belonged. Yet the human passions that had given it temporary and deadly reality, envy, ambition, and the desperate desire for recognition, would continue to haunt the hearts of men and women in every age, requiring the vigilance of those like Hercule Poirot, who understood that the greatest mysteries often lie not in supernatural intervention, but in the dark complexities of the human soul. And so our tale concludes in the elegant salon of the Pera Palace Hotel, where Poirot has once again proven that no mystery, however shrouded in supernatural legend, can withstand the relentless application of logic and method. What did you think of this mystery? Were you able to solve it alongside the great detective? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed journeying with Poirot and Hastings through Istanbul, please give this video a like and subscribe for more classic detective stories. Your support helps me continue bringing these mysteries to life. Until next time, keep your wits sharp, your curiosity keen, and remember, in the world of Poirot, there are no ghosts, only the very human capacity for both evil and justice. This is Alfie, signing off from Whispers of the Night.